All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about digital responsibilities. I'm Luigi Di Martino, an associate at the Institute for Culture and Society and a curriculum fellow for the Future Thinkers Curriculum Challenge at Western Sydney University. I'm also the CPOD coordinator for the CPOD and digital responsibilities. Before we start and before I introduce a bit what a CPOD is and why we are here, I would like to, together with the digital responsibilities team and the speakers, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of lands upon which we live, learn, and work. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognize that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We extend our respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar today. So just to give you everyone a bit of background, I know that there should be students and also academics across the university today, as well as also guests, practitioners. I would like just to give you a small introduction about what is a CPOD and what we do at the 21st Century project. So the 21st Century project is Western Sydney University project that started in 2017, and is really a space in which we experiment with teaching and learning approach, and in particular. In 2021, the 21st Century project started to rethink the way we deliver the curriculum at Western Sydney University, in particular responding to those challenges and opportunities that have been presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a response to these challenges and opportunities, the 21st Century project came up with three main streams of activities. The first one was about transforming curriculum, then transforming teaching, and innovating alternative credentials. So, as part of the innovative curriculum, we created five challenges. Which are the future thinkers, global citizen, innovative entrepreneurs, sustainability advocates, and STEM plus, which are kind of five big topic issues that our times. And this CPOD on digital responsibility sits under the future thinkers curriculum, and which is led by Dr. Jenna Condi and Dr. James Gorley. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the work of Dr. Jenna Condi, has been helping, organizing this webinar, as well as creating the CPOD. So as part of these streams, we create each group, its team, create what we call CPOD, curiosity pods, which are basically very short course or subjects that are delivered to all students at Western Sydney University, regardless of the course they are enrolled in. So they are open to everyone, and they are free. Usually they run for a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And it's really a space, in which we experiment a bit with teaching approaches and learning. And we try to, we try a new way to teach content, and we also get feedback from students in terms of to what degree those approaches and experiments are actually successful. So the curiosity pods are kind of three aims. The first aim basically is to provide students with exciting, relevant, authentic learning. And then we also provide students with a digital badge, which is basically a form of alternative credential. And then we use the CPOD also to create partnerships with the industry community and students at Western Sydney University. And in particular, the C pod that that is part of this basically seminar. It's a C pod on digital responsibility, and it's basically a taster of the bigger subject, which is on digital identities, which is a first year subject that is delivered for first year cybersecurity students. But also from other students across the university. And in this CPOD, we try to look at how technologies are changing both social and intimate relationship. And what we are really trying to do with this CPOD is to try to to expose students to different kind of experiences of digital technologies, which might be very different from their own experiences. And we believe it is very important, especially for students like students like in cybersecurity, who will be designing and creating the tools that people will use online. So we really believe that it's very important that they are aware and understand the experiences and the challenges that every one of us in different way we experience online. So in terms of the learning outcomes for the CPOD, we look at digital responsibility and the different actors involved in the online space. And we also reflect on the experiences, the implication of online harms for different social groups. And we develop safe and effective strategies to deal with online harms as individual, professionals, and organizations. So big learning outcomes. I guess, the discussion today is going to be also like a very good opportunity to reflect, on all these 3 points. I would like to thank you before we start our CPOD partners, in particular the Young and Resilient Research Center and WESNET. We will have speakers in the panel that are from these 2 organizations. So they will have also time to introduce the organization and to tell us what the organization are about. So before we start with the discussion, I would like to introduce you the students who will be leading and managing the discussion today, who are Thilakshi, who is a student curriculum partner for Future Thinkers and a first-year PhD candidate in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts. Her interdisciplinary research interests include social media, public libraries, subaltern politics, decolonization, and new migrant women. And then Brooke, who is in her final year of a Master of Teaching, primary. She has been a student curriculum partner for 3 years and has worked with both Western Sydney University, the college, and the university. Entering the field of education, Brooke is interested in the immense power knowledge plays within society and loves to grapple with difficult questions. But today she will be the one who will be asking the difficult question to our panel. Thank you, Thilakshi and Brooke, and I will give the floor to you.
Thanks, Luigi. So today we have 4 panelists joining us, and together they bring a wealth of knowledge, all different, diverse in what they bring as well. And I can't wait to hear from them. So first I will introduce Karen Bentley. Karen Bentley is the CEO of WESNET, Australia's national peak body of specialists in women's domestic and family violence services. Welcome, Karen. Karen has worked across multiple sectors in violence against women and has more than 20 years experience in frontline services, peak bodies and government roles. She's a tech enthusiast with a strong anti-violence advocacy. Karen is one of Australia's leading experts on intersection of technology and violence against women. She regularly provides advice to government departments and technology companies as well. Karen has also trained over thousands of frontline workers and other professionals in technology safety and is the co-founder of SafetyNet Australia. Welcome, Karen.
Hello, Dr. Shiva Chandra. He's a researcher at Young and Resilient Research Center at the Institute of Culture and Society, Western Sydney University. He uses creative and innovative methods to explore subjectivity and how individuals relate to their social worlds. Dr. Shiva is interested in exploring how scholarship can sit at the intersection of academia and community development with the aim of improving people's lives. His interests include sociology of personal life, sexuality, gender, race, and decolonization. Welcome, Dr. Shiva.
Next, we have Dr. Ashlee Gore. Ashlee Gore is a criminologist and a lecturer at Western Sydney University. Her overarching priority is gendered violence with a focus on violence against women and the social, cultural, and legal constructions of responsibility. Recent publications of hers include the monograph, Gender, Homicide, and Politics of Responsibility, Fatal Implications. Welcome, Ashlee.
And lastly, Professor Amanda Third. Professor Amanda Third is a professional research fellow in the Institute of Culture and Society and co-director of the Young and Resilient Research Center at Western Sydney University. An international expert in youth-centered participatory research, Professor Amanda's work investigates children's and young people's technology practices, focusing on marginalized groups and rights-based approaches. She has led child-centered projects to understand children's experiences of the digital age in over 70 countries, working with partners across corporate, government, and not-for-profit centers and children and young people themselves. She's the program co-leader in the Center for Resilient and Inclusive Society, the lead author of Our Rights in a Digital World, a snapshot of children's views from across the world, published in 2021, Young and Online, Children's Perspective on Life in the Digital Age in 2017, and Young People in Digital Society, Control Shift in 2019, and a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Welcome, Professor Third.
Please join us in doing a virtual welcome to our panelists today. I believe the conversations that we're about to have are not only interesting, but insightful, but very thought-provoking. And I encourage you to grapple with these questions as well that we're attempting to answer. Over the next 45 minutes or so, Thilakshi and myself will host a Q&A, as Luigi pointed to, about all things digital responsibility. At the end, we will open up the floor to you guys as well. So please involve yourself in the chat or the Q&A button. So strap yourself in and here we go. So first, I'm going to head over to Karen, put you on the spot. So Karen, your focus area is domestic violence in digital spheres as well, and all things digital platforms. So my first question is, are digital platforms safe for people who you work with, and why or why not? And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Thanks, Brooke. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Bentley. I'm just coming to you today from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm down here in central Victoria, and yes, so our organisation WESNET is the national peak body for domestic and family violence services, and we work with about 350 frontline sort of shelters, refuges, domestic violence crisis services, men's behaviour change programs, a whole range of community services that actually try to support victim survivors who are experiencing, you know, domestic violence, family violence, intimate partner violence. And then we also have some members who sort of look after rape crisis or sexual assault services as well. So we're sort of the peak body that, you know, looks after that section of the workforce that is trying to support and help people who are experiencing gender-based violence. And about 10 years ago, we started to notice that technology was starting to play a real part in the lives of these survivors. And we first noticed it when women who were going to secure refuge accommodation found that their abuser turned up outside pretty quickly afterwards. And it was just like, what's going on? And at first we thought maybe, you know, he followed her or something like that, but we started to realise that technology was starting to play a bit of a part. And it's really just exploded since then, because we're really fully in the digital age now. So, you know, we're talking about digital platforms today, and what we've found through our own experience working with our member services, but also in some of the research that we've been doing, is that if you're experiencing intimate partner violence now, or domestic violence, or family violence in Australia at the moment, it's pretty likely that some of that abuse is going to be delivered to you via technology. So we've been doing a lot of work around this intersection between technology and violence against women in particular, because that's the area that we sort of specialise in. But what we found is, you know, virtually every form of communication or digital technology is being misused by abusers as a tool to actually perpetrate abuse. So in terms of, whether digital platforms are safe, I think, it really depends on who you are and where you are and what your circumstances are in and who's hurling abuse at you. But for very many people who are in intimate partner violent relationships, digital platforms are not particularly safe because they're a place where somebody can hurl abuse at you, they can threaten you, they can stalk you, they can humiliate and embarrass you. There are so many different ways now that all of these types of abusive behaviours that we are familiar with in real life are now playing out on digital platforms. And I think what we see is that digital platforms have made it extraordinarily easy to be able to do those types of abuse and reach many, many more people and involve so many more people as well. And the other thing is that it's 24/7. So there's a sense that while you might have been able to put some distance between you and your abuser at some point in the past, with the digital age now, we're really starting to feel like, it's much harder to put that distance because we can contact each other and communicate with each other in so many different ways. That said, we really strongly want to make sure that people can access technology. So we also see that technology makes people much safer. So we really try to concentrate on how do we work with victims and survivors of intimate partner violence and other forms of gender-based violence so that they can stay on technology and use technology to actually get support, help in ways that 10, 15 years ago, they could not possibly have dreamt of getting. So it's a double-edged sword. But yes, I don't think that a lot of digital spaces or tools may necessarily be safe, but we also need to look at the flip side, which is that they can also be a way of connecting and staying in touch.
I like that you bring a countered view to it as well. You're not just saying everything's all bad. And you mentioned that it is also a digital platform. They make it a very easy for this to happen majority of the time. And you mentioned the abusers, and it leads me to my next question, because to me, this would have quite a simple answer, but I think the answer could be quite complex at the same time. Who is responsible for digital safety? Is it the platform itself? Is it the person hurling the abuse, as you say? Is it the person who's unfortunately receiving it? Should they take themselves off? It seems very simple to answer that in the terms of it's the abuser's problem and that's their responsibility, but is that the way it is, or is it more complex than that?
I think it is more complex than that. And it's quite easy, I think, for people to think, oh, well, if you're being abused on technology, we'll just get off the technology. And that is the reality of very many people who are experiencing intimate partner violence through technology, facilitated abuse, as we call it, which is that, they pop off to the local police and say, look, he's putting horrible messages about me on my Facebook or something such. And the police's reaction was, there's nothing I can do about it. It's, that's Facebook, it's in America. And why don't you just get off Facebook, love? Which is very sort of unhelpful. So I think there are some community attitudes around which are very much around it's your responsibility as a potential citizen to avoid being abused. And it's very much in the space of intimate partner violence and gender-based violence, the role and responsibility is often on the victim to avoid it. So, and it's very much like, don't go out after dark wearing a short skirt if you don't want to be attacked, don't provoke people. So we see the same kind of attitudes happening with digital spaces as well, for some part. We also see sort of something else happen here, which is that if we didn't have these digital platforms, we wouldn't have this abuse. So there's a sort of a blame on the digital platforms saying, no social, no Facebook, no Instagram, no Snapchat, whatever, then we wouldn't be having this abuse. Well, yes, we would, because abusers would have always, displayed these behaviours. They just find different tools on ways to do it. So it's not necessarily entirely the digital platform's responsibility. I don't believe it should be the victim's responsibility, although every digital citizen needs to do some things to sort of maintain their safety. We need to be doing a lot more in terms of the abusers. And for this particular issue, which is really gender-based violence, we need to be trying to work on ending gender-based violence, as well as racism, homophobia, and all of those, ableism, all of those other oppressions in our society. Because until we do that, we are always going to have populations that are picked on and abused just because of who they are or what they represent. And I think for us to do that, we are going to have to be all working together, and that's at every level of society. So we're going to need to be doing it as individuals, we're going to need to be doing it in our families, in our schools, in our communities, in our local neighbourhoods, and then businesses and corporates, governments, community services, everybody is going to need to play a role so that we can banish those oppressions and hopefully stop some of those types of violence happening, which just happened through that. So no simple answer. Yeah, and it is going to be a whole of society.
I like that you did mention it. It is a societal shift or a societal problem that we all have to grapple with. And I hope that everyone else listening today is also realizing that regardless of whether you're experiencing this or not experiencing this, it's something that's out there and it's something that's happening. And it's our responsibility as much as it is anyone else's. And this also brings me to my final question, and then I'll let you sip your tea and sit back and relax. But you did mention that some people argue these technology platforms are making it much more easier for this to happen. And you're right, it would happen either way. So do we need to work on making more caring or more responsible technologies? And if we did this, how would we do it? I don't know. And would it solve the problem, or is it, as you said, larger than just a social platform?
I think you summed that up really well, Brooke. And I mean, two points there. The first thing is that when governments were starting to try and do something about this epidemic of gender-based violence in the 90s, they really approached it as if it was an individual's problem. There were certain individuals in our population who experienced gender-based violence, be that violence against women, domestic violence, be it other forms of gender-based violence that we see in our society. But in more recent years, governments are starting to see that this is, yes, it is an individual's problem and an individual has to deal with it when it happens, but this is a societal problem and it's a whole of system problem. And there are many, many systems that we've got in our society today that reinforce those types of stereotypes. For example, government services that rely on a cisgendered heterosexual couple and the family unit. All of these things lead to gender roles or gender stereotypes, which then cause that if you fit outside that mold, you have a different experience. So that's sort of the first thing. And then that can take us on to more caring technologies. And what we're seeing now is that, social media companies to some extent and large corporations, particularly in the telco industry and other industries like banking, where these are really essential services. You cannot exist without them. They're starting to recognise that, violence against women and gender-based violence is so prevalent that around about a third of your customers potentially have either experienced or are right in the middle of it right now. And what are they doing in terms of their customer service or their interaction with the customer about making sure that their service is right for them and isn't being misused or turned around and weaponized by an abuser? And so we've seen several examples of technologies that are being weaponized, and a lot of the digital abuse that we see on social media platforms is a classic example. Oh, here's a fabulous tool where I can share a really abusive, humiliating story about my ex-partner with millions of people. And so, but they're playing catch up because they didn't design the technology with this particular cohort of customers in mind. So when you design for the, everybody and you are inclusive and you think about all of those things, then you'll design a much better product. We're now seeing corporations really start to play catch up. You know, we're the type of organisation, for example, that will get contacted by a large telco who's bringing out a new product or service and say, can you see any problems with this with domestic violence? And we're like, yeah, here we go. Have you thought about X, Y, Z? So there's starting to be a lot more collaborations between NGOs like us and corporations and academics and researchers to say, how can we build and design new products and services that keep in mind that many of the customers may be victims and survivors, many of the users might be abusers who are going to misuse your tool, and then also even for their own workforces. Like, you know, if you are an employee of, I don't know, a large telco, let's say Telstra, for example, and you're working in a Telstra shop and you have somebody come in front of it and explain, I'm experiencing horrible abuse through my phone. It's about helping those workers as well. So corporations are starting to see that. And they also have mini populations which they can influence, so that, you know, those community attitudes that we have, we can all be playing a role in educating, raising awareness, and also trying to support and end all of the violence and abuse.
I think you've started us off quite nicely, and it's a really well-rounded approach as well. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen, again. And it was really good to hear from someone in your position as a practitioner with a service-based perspective. So now I turn to Dr. Shiva. So while talking about these social shifts and inclusive technologies, as a researcher whose interest travels around communities marginalized by the society, as well as community development, what do social media platforms make possible for queer communities? What do the platforms enable for queer people, and what do they constrain?
Yeah, also, sorry, just before I start, my internet connection is unstable. So if I'm completely dropping out, someone just let me know. Yeah, so I think, you know, there are three things that I think they do quite well. And so, you know, my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Hankel, and I did a study last year where we looked at the use of social media by 65 young people across Australia of different ethnic backgrounds and in different contexts, so rural, urban, and regional Australia. And so some of the things we found is that, you know, at a very basic level, the social media platforms make it possible to find people that are like oneself. So like others, right? So for example, if you're someone living in rural Australia where you might not have a sense of queer community or other queer people, the internet's a great way to actually find people like yourself, which may not actually be available in a physical space. And of course, that's important because, you know, it can be affirming to one's sense of identity, that you're not alone. There are other people like you that share your identity. So I guess that's one of the great things that it can provide. The other thing, I guess, related to that is a sense of community, right? So the fact that you belong to a group in some way. So that communal sense of belonging is also quite important to some people, and it can provide that. But it also allows people to actually explore their gender and sexuality. So it actually is a means through which to gain more information and more knowledge about gender and sexuality, and to explore those aspects of who you are. So, you know, to put it in like academic terms, you'd say, you know, it's important to self-making and understanding and constructing who you are, if we think of that as something that's made through social processes and shaped by social processes. So it can be really important in that way too. I think, you know, when it comes to thinking about, you know, how it can be constraining, I think, you know, the one thing that comes to mind is the public nature of it. So it's quite public, right? And there is an emphasis on being public about one's identity on social media platforms. So for example, and there's an idea of authenticity that kind of underpins the way platforms allow you to have profiles. So for example, on Facebook, you can't have more than one profile, right? It's actually against the policy to have more than one profile. And for someone who doesn't want to be outed about the gender and sexuality, it's actually quite a fraught thing, right? So how do you explore who you are without accidentally outing yourself through that process? And so that's quite a tricky thing to grapple with. And, you know, and this idea that secrecy is bad or hiding is bad or not being open is bad is quite problematic. You know, if you know, we often have ideas about hiding and secrecy as being negative things, but really they're actually quite, you know, they're actually quite important to some people in order to do certain things because of the risks that might be involved. So, and I think sometimes, you know, platforms don't understand that secrecy and hiding are productive and actually create safety. However, you know, going kind of, you know, linking back to what Karen was talking about earlier, we can see how that can also be problematic. I can imagine secrecy being used to also harass people. So it's a double-edged sword that we then need to think carefully through, well, how do we enable that to be productive, but also how do we make sure that that doesn't lead to nasty outcomes, which I can imagine happening, especially in the area that Karen works in. Yeah, so I think, you know, and I think, you know, there are some, I mean, so I'm also part of a group called Fob Gays Plus, which is a queer organization for people of South Asian descent and their friends and families. And so I've actually been someone who's created content as well and been a part of it. And so what we've done in the past is make videos which have South Asian parents in them or family members. And they're quite shareable. And so what that allows us to do is create content that people can share with their families in their own time, right? But I guess that's a possibility that comes out of these platforms, is that you can create materials that people can use in ways that are fit for their life, in ways which make sense to them. And I think that can be quite a beautiful thing, that we're able to make that material and share it.
Thank you so much. I think it's very interesting. The way you spoke about identity, it gave the idea that it's not something isolating and it's not about just one person, it takes a whole community. And so that leads to my second question. Who is responsible for creating and maintaining these safe spaces that you spoke about? And also, what can we as individual people who are a part of this community be doing to support these people from marginalized groups to be themselves online?
Yeah, great questions. I think so. And I think, you know, Karen kind of said this, and I think, you know, at a fundamental level, everyone's responsible, right? And I say that because the internet is a thing which has affordances, it allows you to do certain things, and then it has constraints. But the thing is, it's just a thing. It's not, it's there and it exists within society. And I mean, let's take the metaphor of a knife. I can use it to stab someone, which would be quite bad, or I can use that to make a meal for a loved one. It's the same thing, but the use of it and what it's doing is different according to my actions and what I've done with it, right? But it's the same object, which has potential. I mean, you wouldn't want a blunt knife, right? So a sharp one's good. So it gives it potentialities because it's sharp, and it allows it to do certain things. And I think what I'm actually saying is that if you have a society that is queerphobic, you're going to have queerphobic internet. They're not separate. So the thing is, yeah, I think often we think of it as, oh, what can the technology do? But really the technology exists within a broader milieu, right? So if you have a society that is less homophobic, I would expect the internet would also be less homophobic because it's part of society. It's not separate in some way. And so I think, you know, so in that sense, the lazy answer is everyone. But I think, you know, but I think what that also means is you realize what you can do in also non-digital spaces as an individual to make things better. So the everyday conversations that you have with others about, about queer issues, right? These are all going to have an impact on the internet. So I think if we think of our everyday actions with others as filtering through, that can actually be quite a productive way of thinking about it. I do think, of course, platforms do have responsibility, as in they're responsible for the thing that they're creating and making. So I do think that they have that special sense of responsibility to moderate and to do that effectively. So I do think, platforms definitely have responsibility. And I think I've kind of beaten around the bush, but haven't said it, but users. So users are also responsible. Like, if you are being queer phobic on a platform, you're making it unsafe. And you have a responsibility not to act in that way, right? So I think, responsibility lies with that as well. But I think, the overall answer is everyone's responsible. Our governments are responsible. Religious organizations are responsible. If you are saying things that are phobic, you are making the internet an unsafe place, because you're basically saying it's okay to say these things, right? The second part of your question was, what can people do? I think to show support. So I think actually having affirmative content, and actually you don't have to like do anything major, but actually having things that basically show your politics, right? And quite explicitly doing those things are actually quite productive, because, young people, for example, when they're using the internet, will read those things. They will read a profile, see what's there, and that will give messages about what that person's beliefs are, what that person's ideas are, what their politics are. So I think at a very basic level, simple things like that, and not in a tokenistic way. I think, you should genuinely believe them. I think, those things can actually be quite productive for signaling to people that I am a safe person and this is how I relate to the world. I think, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I think actually, yeah, I'll stop it there. I'm sure I can touch on other things as we keep talking.
Yes, and as Karen also touched on this, digital is social and social is digital. You can't separate the two anymore. So that leads to my next question, and this is something that I'm really interested in asking from you. What is the role of an active bystander of social media abuse in online networks, and what training is needed for you to be one? I really want to know your answer to this question.
Yeah, so I think, as I've kind of already indicated, or you would have guessed by now from my previous responses, I think that an active bystander is actually really important. And I think, so look, you can think of an active bystander in possibly doing two things. An active bystander who wants to change someone's mind, and an active bystander who actually isn't there to change the mind, but is actually of someone, but is actually there for the person that is experiencing the victimization, right? So it's not about changing someone's mind per se always, but what is the other person hearing? And what are other people around you hearing? I think that's a really important thing to consider, right? So, for example, if someone is experiencing some form of queerphobic abuse, if someone actually just reiterate and reaffirms that person that's actually experiencing the abuse, that's actually quite important, even if they're not trying at that particular moment to actively change someone's mind or anything like that. And I think that goes some way towards creating a safe digital space, right? I think, if we are going to think about it in a more pragmatic way, and we are like, okay, not pragmatic, but if you're going to think about it as in, okay, so maybe we do want to have a conversation and open up the space for a conversation, right, on a platform. I think it'd be actually quite useful, and training that looks at how do you address people, how do you have the conversations, but how do you also have them for different types of people from different contexts in different ways. I think that would actually be really useful, is actually tools on having these conversations. And I think it's really complicated because everyone brings their own background and context to social media platforms. So how do you have conversations with people and how do you relate to them from different contexts and logics, right? That they may have, and how can you use those logics and speak to them, right? So I think it's complicated, but a contextualized understanding of how you have conversations with people in online spaces, I think can be quite helpful. Like I was sometimes, explaining trans issues in Fijian Hindi to my mum, and I'm like, how do I do it? Like, she speaks English, but I think sometimes it can be really productive to use that. And I'm like, well, do I talk about the idea of a soul to at least do some of the analytic work to kind of get to some understanding, right? But, these are really complicated questions. They're not easy, and they actually require a lot of work to think through, I think. Yeah. And, online materials, I think, can be quite helpful. Like I spoke about earlier, actually having those things that you might want to use as a bystander. So the availability of those resources, I think, is quite important. Taking care of yourself, right? So, I mean, if you think of all the isms there are, and if you're going to be a bystander for all the isms, you can imagine burnout, right? And you can imagine, if you're constantly doing that, it can actually be exhausting. So I think an active bystander, one of the key skills would be also to know how to take care of yourself, knowing when, knowing how to let go of things and move on. Because I know that I can sometimes carry it with me and still be annoyed about something. And also knowing when maybe you don't need to intervene. If you've done a lot of it, then maybe knowing that actually it might be nice to, but can I really do this? And I think that brings me to another point, which is that, not all bystanders are positioned in the same way. So for example, if you do have greater privilege or with respect to a particular thing, right? So for example, you can be allies to people for certain things, but also be the recipient of allyship. So for example, I could be an ally to Amanda when it comes to gender as a man, and Amanda could be an ally to me when it comes to queer issues because I'm queer. So there is this give back and forth. So I think that's another thing to think about is who has privilege when it comes to allyship and who should use it, because our responsibilities are not all the same. They're dictated by the privileges we have.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, I have to cut you short.
No, all good. All good.
To move to the next speaker, and thank you. I really needed to hear that you need to let go at some point, even while being an active bystander. So thank you so much.
Not a problem.
And over to Brooke.
I think that also leads on nicely to Ashlee. You're next. But you mentioned that different people have different powers, and that's how we can really show our allyship in our power. And Dr. Ashlee, you look at the legal constructions of responsibility, and it's been alluded to, but I don't think it's been discussed in depth. And some of your work is just so complex, interesting, and heartbreaking at the same time. So my first question to you is, what can professionals working with and designing digital technologies do to address this harm that we're all discussing?
Thanks, Brooke. You're right, it is a really hard and heartbreaking discussion. There's no one thing, unfortunately, that professionals can do. Instead, I think there's a multitude of things that we need to be looking at. I guess to start with, throughout my discussion, I'm thinking about multiple forms of abuse. So sometimes I'm going to jump between some different examples. And that's part of the complexity here. There's no necessarily one size fits all model here. But for me, in terms of what I think, digital harm and abuse occurs across a spectrum of ignorance, exploitation, and inaction. So professionals addressing digital harm means responding to that triarchy of factors. So again, like I'm thinking through multiple types of abuse here, but if we think about ignorance to start with, Karen already has given us some really important examples of the way that the technology design in certain instances has been designed with an ignorance as to how that can be weaponized to abuse certain vulnerable populations. Karen gave us some really important examples about how technology is used to stalk victims of domestic and family violence. I have some connections to DV shelters as well, and it's a real problem. You know, they really have to encourage women coming to DV shelters to do a really thorough scan of the technology that they have, their phone, any smart technology, Apple Watches, look at their car, look for stalking technology that's been implanted somewhere, their children's toys. They have to go through their children's toys like teddy bears and things like that to see if there's any GPS trackers that have been put in there. And again, when companies are designing some of this technology, that's an afterthought, that this is going to be used to weaponize, to be weaponized against, in particular, victims of domestic and family violence. Some of these are fairly obvious. If you're designing spyware, you know, like, what do you really think people are going to use that for? Others are a little bit harder to pick up on. So another example that's come out recently is banking apps. So abusers who have already had their victims block them through their phone number, through Facebook, through social media, are using CommBank apps to send a small amount of money to that person, like $1, and use the text field there to write abusive messages, and they continue to do that. So just sending, you know, like $1 and using that to keep the contact and the abuse going. So one issue here is an ignorance to how technology can be weaponized and used to abuse people. And again, Karen has helped give us some context around that. So yeah, largely I think what we have to confront there is how technology can operate in a zone of ignorance about the usability of that technology to enact certain kinds of harm. Part of the background here is that a lot of our traditional ideas about cybersecurity is focused on stranger threats. We need to reconfigure that to think about intimate threats. And we really need to have professionals be proactive in addressing their ignorance and proactively thinking about how technology can be co-opted and weaponized. That sounds like I'm putting a lot of responsibility on them, and I am, but there are also resources out there like WESNET, for example, and the E-Safety Commission that have resources to help people building online platforms and technology think about some of these issues. So ignorance is a big factor. Shifting my focus a little bit, the design of certain online platforms, so thinking not about, you know, some forms of technology now, but online platforms, the design of those is often built on a foundation of exploitation. And that can be an issue then as well. So digital platforms, and I'm thinking here of things like, you know, Facebook and Twitter. On a more severe end, I've done some work on pornography sharing sites like Pornhub as well. These platforms are profit driven, they're economically driven, and they're focused on attracting more and more users and thereby generating greater advertising revenue. So the more users they have come to their site, the more profitable it is for them. The more content they have on that site, the more users they're going to get coming to that site as well. So an unintended result of that kind of business model around maximizing profit by keeping users consuming online content is that the host of exploitative content then becomes an issue. So again, here I'm thinking about some recent controversies over digital content hosting sites. So again, sites like Facebook, Twitter, Pornhub, where their profit margin is about hosting as much content as possible. Regulating that content is actually counterintuitive to their bottom dollar line. So social media companies can actually be invested in maintaining online environments that are conducive to abuse. There can be a disincentive there for them to actually confront abuse happening on their platforms. disturbing example that I've heard about that recently is there was some information leaked from Facebook's content moderators who were there to moderate content that's been flagged as illegal or abusive. And the information that they leaked suggested that Facebook was telling them to err on the side of sort of like a liberal interpretation of what abuse is, and to err on a liberal interpretation about the age of a victim in something that looks like it might be a child, exploitation material image, for example. So I think a culture around platform capitalism and exploitation is another factor. So professionals working to design digital platforms, what kind of culture are you hoping to create? And how can you balance a profit-driven incentive against the needs and safety of your users? That leads into my final big point that professionals need to address, which is inaction. So we know that a lot of platforms, again, have taken broad discretion in determining what response they give to harmful content when it is actually flagged by users. We've seen multiple examples come out over the last few years that have shown that users across platforms are flagging and reporting certain types of content as being abusive. And these platforms, again, are taking a very broad line in making a determination or in deciding if that example fits their definition of what abuse is on their platform. Again, one of the examples that comes to mind for me there relates to the Pornhub scandal that emerged over the last 2 or 3 years. So we saw some really disturbing examples of real rape and child sex abuse material ending up on this platform. Survivors themselves were finding that their abuse material had been posted there. Survivors were being responsibilized to flag that for removal, and the platforms really dragged their feet. They distinctly took a position of inaction and only really acted when there was huge public and economic pressure. So, for example, MasterCard and Visa pulled their support for Pornhub once they caught wind of this situation, and that finally prompted some of these companies to get their something together. I was going to swear.
Yeah, get their act together. Is as simple as that.
There we go.
I'm a student. I'm allowed to say that. I do want to give you a panelist award because you've just answered my second question, was if should the people designing the technology take a Hippocratic oath such as a doctor would, and I think you've kind of answered that. Instead of having this ignorance and afterthought, let's make it a thought before we start designing as well. But my next question is, because you do look at gendered violence as well, how are gender inequalities reflected in this digital space?
I think drawing on some things that Shiva and Karen have already pointed out, we need to stop thinking that the digital space operates in a silo, that it's somehow separate to what happens in the offline world. It's a reflection and extension of what happens offline, and the two are mutually constitutive as well. So like Karen and Shiva has sort of mentioned already, if we live in a society that's structured around certain gendered inequalities or structured around queer inequalities, we're going to see that play out in online spaces, but also we're going to see those online technologies co-opted by some people to preserve those inequalities when it serves their interest. And we've certainly seen that when it comes to forms of gendered violence against women. Multiple examples that I can think of where women are perceived to be stepping out of their place, that they encounter forms of backlash and violence in online spaces. So online technologies are used to perpetrate forms of gendered inequality because those already exist offline. And again, Karen and Shiva have already pointed out across these multiple spaces of inequality, basically we need to be taking an upstream prevention approach. We need to be taking a public health approach to these issues, which focuses on prevention across multiple levels.
We're just giving all the panelist awards to you today. Because my next question was, why are women more likely to be targets of online abuse? And everyone's just pointed that as well. It's a reflective of society. But my next question and my final question is, and I've asked everyone else this, but I think it's really important to see a whole bunch of different perspectives. What can we do online as active bystanders or just someone else using an online platform to potentially stop this from happening? And the reason I'm asking everyone is because everyone else is going to have a different way to tackle this, which I think is really good.
I've done a lot of talking. Does anyone want to jump back in? Let me have a think about that.
I don't necessarily have any sort of clues about how to act as a bystander, because I think it's a sort of a decision for everybody. But I think the more that you understand about the ways and the more examples you see of other people doing it, the great. So I really like some of Shiva's recommendations around, like, we do need resources and stuff that we can share and use. And so the more of those that are around, the better to help people with that bystanders. You know, it's a pretty tricky thing, and sometimes you've got to be pretty brave as well, because you're going to put yourself at risk. And I think a lot of people do that. But I do think we see differences in society as well about, you know, just like, and there've been some studies done, you know, showing that, you know, if you've got somebody bleeding in a bus stop, they just get passed by. Like, nobody stops anymore because they're too worried about their own safety. So I think we've got a lot of work to do in this kind of space to sort of try and boost each other up and do that ally stuff to be able to learn, well, how do I intervene? What can I park something in my brain so the next time I come across it, I've got a tool that I can use.
And I would just add to that, like I am fully behind what people have been saying on this call about active bystanders, but I do think there's also a constraint around the idea of the active bystander, in that it tends to confine the locus of our actions to those moments when we see something going wrong. And actually what we need to be doing, all of us collectively, all around the world, whether we're young or old or whatever, is actively creating the internet that we need, an internet that is a nice place to be, a good place to be, a safe place to be, not just for some people, but for everyone involved. And I think, you know, so, and it's really a subtle thing. And I was prompted to remember, Karen, as you were talking earlier about intimate partner violence and the kinds of ways that technology is being used to perpetuate that sort of violence. I was also thinking, you know, there's a very thin line between the kinds of surveillance and control that the average person accepts on a day-to-day basis, like, for example, our friends knowing where we are, our partners being able to check up on us or send us messages and expect responses and all of this sort of thing, and the kinds of behaviours that we associate with perpetrators of very serious violence, right? So, you know, there's a slippage that's going on, and I think there's something very important for us to be grabbing hold of and thinking about there. And that would come into, though, I guess, the kind of consciousness that I want to associate with being an active bystander. Active bystanders are not just about it's not just about when people are in trouble. It's about the things that you do every single day. It's about what you do to help create an internet that's a good place to be.
Thank you so much. Professor Amanda Third, I would turn to you for my next set of questions. So we have talked about technology facilitated abuse of various communities and digital responsibility as a concept. So, but we haven't talked about children, and these are the people who are being brought up with technology, and they would be using technology even more than we do. So I would turn to my first question. Who should be responsible for technologies for children? And is this a national or a global responsibility? And where do children fit in all this? Fit in this discussion?
Thanks, Thilakshi. It's a really great question. And before I do launch in, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the land that's been looked after for thousands of years by the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So where do children fit into this equation? So I think when it comes to thinking about digital responsibilities and questions of online safety, actually children are very frequently the first group of people that we think about. And we spend an enormous amount of money, so-called educating children, building campaigns, online safety resources, and so on, in order to try to help children feel safer online. I think one unfortunate thing is that we actually have very little good, robust evaluation around a lot of those initiatives, and we really don't know if those campaigns have the desired effect. And indeed, one little piece of research that we've just recently done, which I've just posted in the chat there, where we talked to young Australians about the education that they receive about being online and how to be safe, they're really clearly telling us that we are missing the mark. What we tend to do is we tend to educate children about the very extreme end of online safety risks, and those things do occur. I don't want anyone to be under any misapprehension that those things don't occur, because they do. Children sometimes do encounter incredibly serious forms of risk online and spend their lives recovering from those kinds of harm. But at the same time, I think what we do for children is that we scare them that a lot of, that they're going to encounter these very terrible risks by being online. And we don't actually connect up our sense that they need to take care with the realities of their lived experience online, right? So actually, when you talk to children and young people, they will tell you, first of all, that they are worried about being kidnapped or having their identity stolen or some of the, being sexually exploited online, etc. They'll tell you sometimes some of those things come out, and they may also catastrophize about those things, like, that is the end of life if that happens to you. But on the other hand, actually when you dig a little bit deeper, they actually are mostly concerned about very localized things, like the drama that happens between friends online, things they see online that they don't want to see, this kind of stuff. The locus of their concerns is really centered quite close to themselves as an individual. And I think what we don't do, we scare them that that there are all these terrible things that are going to happen, but we don't connect up that sense of real threat with the things that they experience. And so what they learn to do is they learn to speak a double language. And I often in my work call this the Santa Claus effect. And I hope this is not a spoiler for anyone on the call, but Santa isn't real. And but what children do is, when they learn that, is that they continue to participate in this fiction, right? They nod and smile at the adults who talk about it, and agree with them that this is what's going to happen. And of course, there are real material benefits for children for participating in that fiction, right? They get Christmas presents. But what happens with digital technology and online safety is, when adults begin to talk to them, they know they have all of these rote lines rehearsed about how they should turn on their security settings, and they should not talk to strangers, and all of these other things. And then underneath all of that, they have another life, and they have a lot of peer support. They learn from peers. They learn tricks of the trade. They're actively protecting themselves. Sometimes they're taking too many risks. But there's a very complex set of activities going on between by young people, and that's not sort of connected up to the online messaging that we get. So I think we've got to do a lot better at enabling children to really grapple with what the challenges are, and to find child-centered or youth-centered ways for them to experiment with taking risks online, and developing the protective skills and behaviours that we know will ensure that they can be safe online. And I think that's, I think this is so children. I mean, the answer to the question, you know, who is responsible is, as everybody else has been saying on this call, that it is a collective and shared responsibility. Platforms need to take responsibility, so do governments, so do teachers, so do, you know, the parents, children, all of the people who are implicated in a child's ecosystem are responsible for helping to keep them safe. But I think the challenge with saying that everyone has a part to play is actually then identifying what each particular group can do and take charge of, right? It's about how do we responsibilize and create the kinds of actions that are really going to take us forward. So I think that's a real challenge for us. And I think when it comes to empowering children and young people in terms of helping them to make the internet a safer place,
I think there's something wrong with her internet. Brooke, shall we go to a question till then from the audience? So there's a question from Dr. Thai Pazeta. Can the panel point to examples of technologies that have been designed with equity and justice at the core? Do they scale for commercial and justice users? So I would probably, yes, turn to Karen. Thanks, Karen.
We've recently set up on one of our websites something called the App Safety Centre, and it's because there's a plethora of developers out there who are all, some of whom are trying to sort of develop really good apps that might help survivors sort of report abuse, record abuse, reach out for help, which is great. But there are a whole bunch of developers out there who are really just in it to sort of cash in on, you know, this new and emerging trend of intimate partner violence and technology. So we've set up a centre where we are reviewing the apps to see whether or not they're safe and sort of provide information so people can make really informed decisions about whether or not they want to use the apps. And as part of that, we actually have come across one particular app that was designed, and it was co-designed. Two actually, there were two that were co-designed with the communities that they were trying to support, and they were done with researchers, they were done with, you know, government funding, and they were also done with companies who were really, really committed to making sure that the product that they were developing was safe for all of the users. They thought about all of the different issues, and it was co-designed. And when we start to do those co-design principles where you are talking about that, I think you can get very ethically, responsibly safe applications and things like that bought. I mean, that's in a specific space because it's around apps for intimate partner violence. But I mean, I think you can expand that to just about anything that we are doing. And I think the point that I was going to add to what Amanda was saying is that one of the things that we can really be starting to try and encourage is, you know, this is why we need equity and diversity in our workforces. You know, this is why it's so important that we don't have, you know, gender differences or population differences in the ways in which the people who are building these these products and services are. We have to get more diversity into the people who are actually building these. And welcome back, Amanda. I'll just hand back to you because you were mid-flight on something very interesting.
I'm sorry, clearly someone in the technological universe decided that I was not allowed to say that. Sorry, Karen, I do agree. Do you want to finish making the point though? Because you're clearly making a good point around diversity in the professional workforce, right?
Yeah, so this is where we moved on to questions while you were frozen. And there was a question about, can you point to examples of technologies that have been designed with equity and justice at the core, and do they scale for commercial and justice uses? And so I was just talking about a particular pair of apps that we'd seen in the domestic violence space, which I think had been co-created and co-designed with lots of different people in, right? It's much more expensive to develop those. It takes a lot more time. You have to make a lot more sort of fiddles and faddles to try and make it work. But, you know, one of these apps in particular is actually used to document and collect evidence, which, you know, then actually also had to talk to the justice system about, you know, chain of evidence. Like, you can create this app, but will the magistrate accept your evidence at the end of the day? Like, will it have it follow what's called the chain of evidence? So, you know, and it will be, and I think it will scale. So, you know, there are really good examples. I'll hand back.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yes, Professor, you can finish your point.
I'm sorry, Thilakshi. I really am. I like Shiva, I'm having terrible trouble with my internet lately, and of course it was fine all through the seminar until that point. No, but I was in the middle of saying that that I think, you know, we've bred a generation of very fearful children who, when, you know, they can tell you all of the risks they might face online, but when you ask them the same thing about the opportunities that they might encounter online, they cannot give you a colourful answer. It is, they just really, we have not taught them to imagine all of the possibilities. And the reason I think this is a travesty is because actually we know that, well, that being online is a very, you know, your likelihood of encountering harm online isn't very straightforward. There are lots of intervening factors that make it difficult to predict who and when you might encounter harm online. For example, you know, we know that not all children are equally at risk of harm online, and in fact, it's those children who are most at risk of harm offline who are simultaneously the most at risk online. But at the same time, what we also know is that a lot of time spent online exposes children and others to more potential to encounter harm, right? And this is one of the concerns coming out of the pandemic, is that because we've all been spending a lot more time online, we are likely to encounter more risks. And we have indeed seen escalating rates of online harm across the planet. But also the flip side to that is that whilst you might encounter more harm, you also have more opportunity to develop the skills, particularly the creative and the higher order evaluative skills that keep you safer online, right? So there's a really complex trajectory there. What this means, to boil it down to a quick message, is that we can't just go about teaching children to so-called protect themselves by taking perfunctory steps like putting on their security settings. We have to be encouraging them to think creatively, expansively about the internet and what it offers. We have to really encourage them to develop those skills and open their minds to what, you know, to new ideas about how to make use of the internet. And in doing so, we begin to build a strengths-based platform on which to sort of, you know, I guess, strengthen young people's capacity to keep themselves safe online, right? So we must be really careful that we don't just try to protect, but we also encourage children to maximize the benefits of being online. And that means promoting the opportunities to them. But yeah, but also I think I think there's a lot more we could say there, Thilakshi. Let's move on though, because I know you're short.
Yes. No worries. Actually, since you spoke about schools, and having worked as a teacher myself, I know that we tend to scare kids off internet than having a strength-first perspective. Because of that, I would move to my third question. So what can schools and libraries do for online safety and for digital inclusion? Because these are public everyday spaces that can provide so many opportunities for strength-based online workshops or training. Sorry, I jumped the question.
No, that's quite all right. No, of course. No, look, I think it's, what can schools do? I think we place enormous responsibility on schools to do too many things for children in their everyday lives. And so I think we really need to be careful about saying schools are responsible for digital inclusion and online safety alongside everything else we ask of them. So I'm very conscious of the fact that, you know, many teachers work incredibly hard to try to do the right thing for the children in their care, and they simply don't have enough support around them. But that said, I do think that we are not doing enough to make sure that teachers are really well trained, not just to manage technology in the classroom, but to really harness technology for educational benefit for children and young people. I think, you know, our education systems are going to need to move with the times and maximize the value of technology, because otherwise they will leave a generation behind. It's as simple as that. But teachers can't be expected to get up to speed quickly and easily. We need to invest in them. We need to develop resources. We need to really think carefully about the curriculum and how best to integrate the technology. And then we also need to be thinking about the facilitating environments, right? I've been really distressed. I sat on the panel, the review panel for the inquiry into mobile phone use in for non-educational purposes in primary and secondary schools here in New South Wales. And what was really clear there is that we do not have evidence that banning mobile phones in primary schools and in high schools brings any benefits whatsoever. And I'm very worried that some of the moral panic that is perpetuating around mobile phones in schools is really helping to, it's demonizing technology. And when you demonize technology, you are also in a sense demonizing young people, because technology is quite dear to most of their hearts. But you know, at the same time, I think we need a facilitating environment that can support schools, meaning students, teachers, parents, the broader community around the school, to really think about what is the place of technology in our school, how do we make the most of it, and we need to get past this idea that technology in schools is a problem, a distraction, because actually it could really augment the educational experience. So there's a lot of work to do there. Who's responsible for that? I do think government has a really important role to play in setting the tone, in imagining how we're going to, build this so-called digital economy they keep ranting on about. What are the structures and the supports that actually we need to deliver on that, and make sure that it's safe and our most vulnerable are not exposed to more harm than's necessary. Well, no harm would be really ideal.
All right. There's one more question. Could we make it a bit short because we are out of time? What can the government achieve in this space, and have initiatives such as the E-Safety Commission have been successful? I think the students who are taking the CPOD will be really interested in this question because it's included in their CPOD.
The government has a lot to do here, a lot of work, and I think we really need to begin to move the agenda along. There is actually currently quite a lot of activity going on in the digital space. You may have noticed that we last year passed our National Online Safety Act. This year, we've just had the Online Privacy Bill introduced into Parliament. But I don't think those pieces of legislation are doing the right sorts of things. They are very much trying to control children. There's a very, I think there's a very kind of antagonistic relationship to industry. I would like to see governments trying to work much harder to work with industry to really make sure that what we're designing is, I think there's a lot more power and influence for governments in taking that kind of strategy. And indeed, the E-Safety Officer has done some really wonderful work to try to produce resources around a phenomenon called safety by design, which is precisely about trying to work with industry to build safety in, to bake it in at the design stage in order to enhance safety. It's of course not the only solution government needs to implement, but that's a really fantastic and great step in the right direction. But some of the legislation that is going through, I'm very worried about. Young people in the audience might be interested to know that if you're under the age of 16, you may well need shortly to ask your parent for permission to access a search engine or a social media application. You really should keep your eye on that debate because it could have some serious implications for the way things are done. But I think this kind of, there's too much knee-jerk legislation, not enough really careful thought and planning. And I'm hopeful that I'm deeply invested in the idea that we're going to find a way to do this better in this country. But having said that, Thilakshi, and being aware that you really need a quick answer, I do think that the eSafety Office is a really unique initiative internationally. It was the first, we were the first government to put a portfolio in place to take care of those issues. And it's a portfolio that's being watched very closely across the world. It is doing a lot of very groundbreaking work. But I think the nicest effect for the online safety sector has been to kind of give some structure and purpose and cohesion to the great variety of work that's being done across the nation to try to keep all Australians safe online. It's not a perfect model. I think it's very much the success of that role will be very much dependent on the person who occupies the chair. We're very fortunate to have a strong and vibrant commissioner in place at the moment. But yeah, that's also something to watch.
We have two more questions, and I will just go to the middle one, and it's quite a big question. So whoever answers it, whoever's the lucky one, try and keep it very, very short because it is a bit loaded as well. So thank you, Bravo, for your question. It is, do we need to think deeper and more critically about the questions of how technology design, structure, and systems are ingrained with discourses of colonialism, capitalism? How does this discourse contribute to online ignorance, inequality, abuse, and violence? And there's more. What would it mean to rethink technology alongside decolonial and post-capitalist imaginations, if it's even possible? I'll open the floor because that is quite a big one.
I would just jump in very quickly and say, is it possible? Yes, anything is possible. This is our technology. We should take charge of it and we should make it into what we're going to, what we need it to be. And I think, if there's one nice thing about the fact that we always talk about the digital as the new, I don't believe that that's actually true because technologies always come out of histories, right? But if there's one nice thing about the fact that that's the way we tend to think about it, it's that opens up precisely a space of possibility for thinking what a post-capitalist decolonized internet might look like. And that's an opportunity we have to seize with both hands. But I'll hand over to my colleagues to say something further.
I just want to add that, I've been in this business for a very long time and I've been having the same conversation over and over and over again for very, very many years. And sometimes I've been hitting my head on the desk going, oh my God, we've been having this conversation for 20 years. I can say that for the first time in the last 2 years, we are now starting to have the conversation in much broader dimensions across many, many more people about the colonial impact and the post-capitalist imagination. We are starting to have that conversation for the first time. Before it was in a very select group. It's sort of one of the fundamental underlying principles of feminism and gender equality. So there's hope. I think there is hope.
I was just going to say, I think the idea of discourse is interesting. And of course, that refers to the idea of speech and the actual ideas. But I think it's also interesting to think about the people that make your laptops, the people that make the little chips that go in there, the plastic, where that comes from. How is that linked to global processes of capitalism and exploitation and colonialism? You can't think of that as being not linked to it. So where's the stuff made? But also the people that do the moderating, often people answer moderation is often a solution, but who looks at the nasty stuff? What's their position in society? Who does that job? So I think it's broader than just what happens on the actual screen, but who makes the screen is as important.
All right. Thank you very much. We just have one last question from Ben Hankel, who is behind the on the screen, but is actually helping us, in this seminar. So thank you, Ben. And I guess it's a question to that help us to conclude a bit this discussion. So it's open to all of you and to each of you actually. So you have all spoken about a lot of different ways, different people, organization, and structure, and how they are responsible. So if you could suggest or prioritize one thing, what would you prioritize as a critical next step to address the issue you have spoken about? So I guess, just concluding with one priority for each of you. We may start with Karen, if that's okay.
From where I'm sitting, until we end gender inequality, we're not going to end gender-based violence. So I'm just all in for just trying to at least try and do that, and to bring all my other inequalities along with us and just ending those.
Thank you, Karen. Shiva?
Mine would be, how can we better educate people through technology to change their minds and ways of being in the world that are more productive?
Thank you, Shiva. Ashlee?
I think I have to echo Karen a little bit, which is to shift the focus firstly away from this triage model, where we're just looking at the emergency cases on the severe end of the spectrum, take a few steps back, and let's take a public health model approach to preventing some of these problems upstream, which means addressing fundamental forms of structural inequalities that are links to a lot of these issues that we're talking about.
Thank you, Ashlee.
I'm going to assume it's my turn. I would echo what my colleagues have said on the call, but I would add that I think we need to work with young people much more closely. We need to, because I think there's huge experience with digital there. There's huge imagination. There are big futures ahead of our young people. If we can tap into that, and unleash it on the internet, I think that will move us absolutely in the right direction.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we probably need to miss some of the questions. But first of all, I would like to really thank you for your participation in this debate. I think they've been very interesting observation and examples from you, which two things I want just to highlight. The first one is I think very relevant for cybersecurity students, which is about the internet threats. So thinking not just about the bigger and external threats that organization and companies have, but also think about the threat that comes for people that are close to us. And I think this is a very interesting things that probably in the industry is not always taken into account. And also one other big theme and topic seems to be the fact to go beyond this normative understanding of safety, which is about what is wrong and what is right, kind of to also think about creative way to think about safety, and that's, I think, it's very another important point for cybersecurity students will be the designers of platform and their security in the future. Thank you very much, Karen, Shiva, Ashlee, and Amanda. And I want to also say a particular thank you to Thilakshi and Brooke. Thank you very much. You've been amazing in leading these debates. And yeah, that's all for today. And thank you for the audience for your question, for coming here today. And let's keep the conversation alive, in the C-Pod as well, I guess, among us after this seminar. Thanks.